Hello and good morning, and welcome to our webinar today, where we're talking about better navigating future data risk and regulatory compliance. And I'm from Michael Conway from Renaissance, and we're delighted to welcome you to this session today. The session is really talking about the big shift from security controls to information security management systems and privacy. And we've seen a big drive in that whole area over recent times, and we've a very interesting session for you today. I won't delay with my quick introduction, but just to say, as I say, Michael Conway of Renaissance, we work with Actifile. We're delighted to have the Actifile team along. We're going to have our next session, or the presentation is going to be done by Guy Bavley, who's CEO, and Asif Litai, who's the CTO of Actifile. And they're going to follow in about 1 minute's time. We'll then have a Q&A, and we'll look to finish at about noon. We won't delay you. We'll really appreciate your time. A couple of housekeeping things in relation to today's session. All attendees are muted for the session. The attendees will have the opportunity to ask questions at the end and during the Q&A. And the session is being recorded for those unable to attend. So we'll make this available as an on-demand session later on. Unfortunately, there are some people who were unable to attend due to other conflicting arrangements. But please enter any questions you have into the chat or send them directly to myself. Then we will take those questions later on. But make this as interactive as you can in terms of, or as you would like, in terms of just raising the questions, raising the issues, raising the challenges. Put them out there to us, and we'll get the guys then to answer those later on at about 11:45. Really appreciate your time, and without any further ado, I'll pass you on over to Guy. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Michael, and the team at Renaissance for the excellent introduction. Thank you, everyone who's joining today and the people who will later on watch us on demand. My name is Guy Bavley, and I'm the CEO of Actifile. And today we have a packed agenda for you. We'll start with some introductions, then we'll go into a review of the global and local privacy and security trends that we're seeing as a global company across Northern America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. Then we'll, give you some kind of a background, guidance. Should you wait? Should you jump into action? The pros and cons. And finally, we'll talk about how Actifile and, of course, our partners at Renaissance can help you navigate those turbulent waters of privacy compliance, data security, and security at large, leveraging our data security platform. Just a little bit about ourselves. As I said, my name is Guy Bavley, and I'm the CEO of Actifile. Started my career as an IT manager, continued as a product manager, went over a little bit to the dark side, and now an entrepreneur and a CEO of Actifile, who's the leading data security platform for mid-sized organizations with hundreds of partners around the world and thousands of customers, all leveraging Actifile to discover, monitor, and eventually also secure sensitive data to meet compliance regulation and all in all protect the data. And together with me is Asaf. Asaf, maybe you can introduce yourself in 2 sentences, please. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Asaf Litai, and I'm CTO of Actifile. In my background is over 23 years of data privacy and data security. I was the founder of a company called Port Authority Technologies, which was one of the 2 earliest data loss prevention solutions. Sold it to WebSense, and then that became the Forcepoint data loss prevention solution. So I have a lot of history and a lot of experience in the field of data privacy and data security, going back to the early days.
And just to complete 2 words about our leadership team. So together with Asaf and me is Bill. Bill is our president of go-to-market. Years of experience selling enterprise big and small, solutions, also in the area of security. And last but not least is Alex. Alex is our VP Customer Success, comes with tons of experience working with customers and helping end customers and partners to implement Actifile successfully. Next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to share a little bit background about the market and talk about the worldwide trend that Gartner, you're all familiar with, of course, with Gartner, that says that personal data will be covered under modern privacy regulations by 2024 by 75% of the population. So that means that those requirements, those regulations, those security frameworks are no longer, a story only made by specific governments or specific societies. It's something that, almost covers the entire world, and we can see that. We have partners and customers in not just in Ireland, but in other places in the world. And the regulatory evolution is very much a dominant catalyst for the entire operationalization of privacy. And I think the one important takeaway from this slide is that the responsibility for making this happen, all of those requirements, is now passed to technology, more specifically the security part of technology, under the umbrella of the CISO, the Chief Information Security Office, Security Officer Office. That means that in many times it's no longer the responsibility of a data protection officer or any type of compliance officer, for many reasons. Because many organizations do not have a dedicated privacy practice, it's up to the technology people that operate other security mechanisms to take care of data and data privacy and adhere to regulation and make sure that the data is not stolen or leaked. And I think one of the things we'll talk about today is how those security frameworks have evolved and how is it possible, together with Actifile, to adhere to those regulations and eventually not just comply, but also secure the data. I'd like to pass on now to Asaf, who will take the continuous of the presentation, and we'll meet again at the end of the presentation today. Please go ahead, Asaf.
Hi. So basically, what I want to do is kind of look at the progression of these types of regulations over time and see how we can kind of better prepare and better be ready for these types of regulations. We'll talk about ISO. We'll talk about the interplay between DORA and GDPR and so forth. But I think the first case in which a regulation came along, it wasn't really a regulation at the time, it was more of a framework, was ISO 27001, which operationalized the concept of information security management system, which basically took the CIA model, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and turned it into a framework that you would have to implement in order to be ISO certified under the 27001. Now, the problem with that approach was that it was very, you could you defined your own set of, what was your threat model, what was the information that you had that needed to be tracked, protected, and so forth. And you're sort of able to play around with this and decide that your risk was not, ransomware, or was not PII, private information, and so forth. And you can decide whatever you want. So it was an open framework. So after that came, I think, GDPR was probably the first that came along and said, no, we'll prescribe a lot of this for you. We'll tell you that you have to protect private information, which is non-public information, and try to define what that is. We would try to operationalize some of the decisions around the security. So you basically could not, even if you wanted to be sort of like ISO-ish, you couldn't just exempt out the hard problems. Basically, the EU said you had to comply with these requirements or you would face stiff penalties. So GDPR was first, but there were a lot. So, so for example, things like PCI DSS came before it. There were a lot of regulations in different small localities, like in the UK and other places where privacy was beginning to be an issue for the citizens, and so forth. But after ISO, and specifically after GDPR started, there became kind of a rush of a lot of these types of regulatory frameworks that merged, basically said, it's not enough to say you're ISO compliant, but you have to actually do this for private type of information. Alongside this came a lot of frameworks for security. So how do I operationalize the different silos under ICT or IT security? And for example, one of the main tenets of DORA, which is a resiliency type act, you have to protect the availability, authenticity, integrity, and confidentiality of data. And the interplay with this with GDPR is very clear, because this data can be private information, but it doesn't have to be private information, right? From the resiliency perspective, it can also be corporate information that if it were to be disclosed, would create a resiliency issue. So it would harden the business and so forth, would would cause the stock to go down or any sort of thing. So from the resiliency perspective, they basically said, the idea is you take, for example, you have to be under GDPR. So GDPR is a risk that you have to contend with under DORA, and that would prescribe the private information that you have to protect. And DORA would contribute to what do the controls look like for you to be able to say that you are compliant, which GDPR obviously doesn't do. GDPR basically said you have to protect it, and now go figure out how. DORA says this is what you have to do. Does it mean that if you do all of this and something happens, you're off the hook like everybody wants? That remains to be seen. But at the end of the day, that's the target. So you can think of these as sort of interplay between the two regulations. For example, in common sort of point for both is what happens, how do you report events? So if something happens, how do you report the events? Obviously, GDPR focuses on the privacy issues, and DORA basically says about any sort of resilience issue, you have to report on it, and so forth. We have to remember that DORA is not prescriptive on the concept of privacy, but is prescriptive on the concept of security and resilience. So now we have a pile of regulations, a pile of frameworks. What is the best way to go forward? So what is one way to go forward with it? So for us, we have a lot of customers, medium size, some large, many small size, and it's sort of a very vast ocean, right? Especially you might be a company that has customers in all kinds of places around the world, might have European customers, might have American customers, might have Asians, and so forth. So what is a good way to sort of progress when it comes to this? So for me, it's always been about kind of trying to summarize a few questions or a few kind of concepts that if I ask myself and I can answer in a very, doesn't have to be accurate, we'll talk about that, but has to be, pretty accurate, right? If not, not high resolution, but at least with high accuracy. Is, first is the governance question. So kind of deviate into silos. And the governance question is, for example, which regulations apply to the business? And we have to remember that these regulations might be local. So under local, we would probably be under the most effect, which means I'm under Irish laws, I'm under financial services laws, I'm under, in other laws that are effective in my locality. It might be EU laws. So for example, GDPR, DORA, and so forth. And it might be international. So you sort of think of it as a kind of an onion, where you would say, okay, what's my local responsibilities? What's my, let's call it federal responsibilities in the US, and EU responsibilities in Europe? And what are my international customers, where each one you have to kind of establish what the scope is and whether the scope is relevant to you. Maybe I'm a small company, so this isn't relevant to me. Maybe I'm not a bank, so this isn't relevant to me, and so forth. And then what is under scope for that? So what is the information that I need to manage and maybe protect? And are there blind spots in my understanding of the data? So, for example, you might ask yourselves, do we have US customers? If I don't know how to answer the governance question, I might ask an ancillary question and say, do I have US customers? Do I have US employees? One way to kind of answer that question is, for example, to do a risk assessment and to try to figure out if you collect social security numbers, if you collect addresses in the US, and so forth. And, obviously winnow out things such as consultants and things of that sort, or maybe just business addresses and things of that sort, and come to that conclusion whether you may or may not be under effect of a particular governance framework. And then comes the data related question. So once I understand what the frameworks, or what are the governance regulations that apply to me, so I need to ask myself, what type of data do I collect as a company, and maybe my employees collect, which I may or may not know about. And the quantity of data is probably one of the most important things, because based on the quantity of data, then I can make a decision on whether this is a risky resilience issue, or whether this is something that I can postpone to next year. We'll talk about that. The third is usage-related questions. Once I have data, how are my employees using that data? Are they using it with all kinds of applications that might keep online copies of it? Are they repurposing it? What are employees doing with the data? Obviously, I have my internal processes. So I have my internal banking system, I have my internal investment systems, and all kinds of things, which I more or less understand or can ask somebody about what they do. But also I have the employees that might be doing things like reporting, that might be calculating things, like people don't pay their loans and all kinds of things. So there are a lot of ad hoc business workflows that might be occurring at the same time. And obviously that leads to the question on whether they're doing what they're doing safely. Should they be doing it? And if they should be doing it, is it being done safely? Are they deleting the data at the end? Or is there a repository somewhere that I'm not aware of? And lastly is the risk-related question. This is probably the hardest. We'll talk about it. Is how do I value the quantity of risk? And this is probably the most important question, because when you want to address problems, it's best to address the pressing problem first, and not spend a lot of time in solving the mundane and so forth. And meanwhile, you have a big problem. So assessing the quantity of risk is really one of the crucial things that I think for any regulatory framework, once you understand the risk, you can answer most of the regulatory questions. You might even say, listen, we calculated the risk. It's not relevant to us. It's not a resilience issue. So we're not going to address it. So unless there's a particular, very prescriptive control, then you can just skip over it and do something else. But if you don't understand, if you can't calculate the risk that's associated with data, then you end up with a very big problem and few resources and trying to, and there's no real way to prioritize the issues. How do we interpret and communicate the potential risk of the data? This is critical. What Gartner was saying and Guy mentioned at the front, which is it is the job of the CISO to operationalize data security, data privacy, resilience, and all that, is really a business question. It's not a technology question. It's not a disaster recovery timeline. It's not a vulnerability. It's not anything that's very technical. It's very business oriented. And for a CISO to make these types of decisions is obviously not the right place. Usually, if the risk is high, you should or must take it up to the board, do the necessary reporting and all those things, and prioritize the response. So how do I communicate, interpret, and communicate the potential risk to the data? And to do this, we sort of have to start looking at the likelier data breach scenarios. We'll take a look at what this looks like. So one thing I would like to add when you're considering privacy regulations and resilience and so forth, is that there are timelines, there's more timelines, there's audits, there's all these things. It's always been, and as a vendor, I want to say everything is urgent. You have to do it now. You must buy my system. If you buy my system, you'll be, no, it doesn't work like that. Unfortunately, I would love it to be like that. But you have to make a decision on whether you have to be, you want to be compliant now or you want to wait it out. And that's always a big question, because a lot of times the people who jump in first don't actually get any rewards. And what I mean by that is, the new regulation goes out into the field. You spend a lot of time answering the question. Nobody's sure how the auditors are going to perceive the controls, how they're going to measure the controls. You have all these organizations that are going to try to help you. At the end of the day, it's going to be more of a protracted sort of engagement. It's going to be more expensive. So maybe waiting it out is smart. But at the same time, if you wait it out, then you might end up with risks that you weren't expecting. So waiting it out is not without its risks. So how do you make the determination? I think that the best way to kind of look at this is to say, what is the scope of the regulation and how far does it cover my business? How far does the scope of the regulation cover my business? And how does the risk overlap with what I perceive as my risk? Now, to do this, for example, you might do a risk assessment. You might look at previous risk assessments. You might look at data discovery. You might look at all these types of things and kind of make a determination as to what is the riskiest scenario. One of the ways that I like to kind of look at the concept of risks and so forth is, it's not a new framework, but it is gathering a lot of steam recently, is the factor analysis of information risk model. Now, I won't get into all the different components of this, because that in itself is an entire multi-hour session. But I will say that one of the things you're trying to assess when you look at risk is you multiply the loss event frequency. So how many events, how many risk events took place? In theory, you should look at your SOC and try to look at historical events. Not everyone keeps enough data to do this. And one of the major issues with this approach is that since attacks evolve, what happened in the past might not be relevant to what's going to happen in the future. So it's not a very good predictor looking at historical information. It's not like the number of, we always think of it, it's like a number of car accidents and, and better markings on the road and better, signs and all kinds of safety systems, like all kinds of beeping things and things that avoid you from getting too close to the car in front of you, sort of nudge the numbers a little bit as they become better over time. This is not the way security works. There's a new vulnerability, zero-day exploit, and during the first couple of days, there are a lot of companies that are attacked, and maybe a lot of them are hacked and so forth. So the loss event frequency, the historical loss event frequency, might not be relevant for these zero-day events. But you sort of look at this and say, what is my expected loss event frequency? You multiply that by the loss magnitude, which is what is the amount of data that I have, and what is the value of that data from a risk recovery. And you have both primary losses, which are what does it cost to get the resiliency back? What does it cost to do the disaster recovery, to reclaim the data, and so forth? And the secondary risks, which are things like GDPR fines and everything that is encumbered upon your organization by external, things like customers leaving, things like fines and penalties, additional insurance costs, and things of that sort. So you take these two, and for me, this sort of model puts it very nice in kind of a mental process of saying, try to think about what you know about each one of these, and then try to, from that, kind of have a better picture of what the risk looks like. So, for example, one of the things that we do, and this is an image from our software package, Actifile. So this basically said, look at things like, credit cards, search for credit cards, search for things like ID numbers, clearing numbers, and all kinds of financial information, and multiply that by a value. We can talk about where that value comes from, and tell me what is the risk, the potential risk across the organization for this data. Obviously, this is usually a very big number and not a very useful number. We'll talk about why. But it tells me something about whether this is something that I have to watch out for or not, okay? So when you run a risk assessment, one of the things to think about is, what is the type of data that I have to watch out for that I keep a lot of, right? So that it's, if something were to happen to my network resilience, to my ICT resilience, then at that point, I will have to face loss magnitudes, which might be higher than just the operational costs, right? Second thing to look at is, what is the spread of the data? This is actually very useful. Do I have employees that gather a lot of data? Do I have too much data on my servers? Do I archive data, and so forth? What does my data exposure look like from a device perspective? And third question was, how is the data being used by employees? Are they uploading it to WhatsApp? Are they uploading it to OneDrive? Is it the corporate OneDrive? Is it the personal OneDrive? How are employees using the data? Again, these are all questions that you typically would get answers to through a risk assessment, an initial risk assessment, in trying to understand what the data risk profile looks like. So remember the question. So we said we'll look at the total amount of data and then try to think about the loss event situations, right? So for example, here I analyzed and I basically split the number from one of our customers into loss potential per number of compromised laptops and versus loss potential per number of compromised workstations. And I also took, the average case. So basically took the overall risk and divided it by the number of devices, so 25 devices, or 15 devices and 10 workstations. And also took the worst case, which is the machine with the most data, and then the machine with the next most data, and second that, and third, and so forth. And then built graphs which compare the worst case in red and the average case in blue. And you can see that in the case of the laptop, I have very high risk if the wrong laptop was to be compromised, because the average is only $208,000, which be still high, but in comparison to 2.4, that's, I know what I'd prefer, right? So in this sort of case, I know sort of where I need to take this in order to reduce my risk to a more of an average sort of risk, and to try to minimize the amount of damage that will happen. In the case of the workstations, I can see that it's a lot better, right? The difference between the average and worst case is not as high as it is in the laptop space, but still there's place to fix. And I know that there are outliers that that I should look at and see how I can fix their privacy sort of loss magnitude, if you will. This also shows from a sort of a board perspective at what is the risk from different scenarios, right? So the scenario is one laptop, two laptops, and so forth. So if I think about things like lateral motion in the network, if I think about things like identity management and so forth, it is clear why I need these types of technologies. It is clear why I need archive to archive that $2.4 million, and all that thing is to basically create visibility for what the risk really looks like, and not just a large number that everybody thinks I'm trying to scare them with. But this is what a potential scenario will look like, and not just a big number, which is assuming that every machine is broken into and totally stolen, which is unlikely given EDRs and XDRs and intrusion prevention and so forth. So hopefully there is security there, but if there isn't, then that's a different issue. Another another thing to look at is, for example, age of data. And this is another way to look at data, and basically says, how old is the data that I'm keeping? One of the things that we see a lot in data loss scenarios is that there is data you needed to have, but the real penalties and the real fines get applied when there's a lot of data that you didn't need, right? So if there's a lot of data that is old, if there's a lot of data that you should have cleaned up, these people paid their loans and now it's just files sitting there, then at the end of the day, it's a high risk. So if I look at data from a perspective of age, then it tells me sort of whether my risk is just having to explain why I process so much data, or is my risk going to look like, how do I explain having so much data and old data that I don't need to keep, right? Which is already, they paid their loans, they've left, they no longer use the service and all these things, and yet at the same time I'm keeping their data. Okay, so that's from the perspective of the risk analysis and understanding the risk. I'll hand it off to Guy. Guy?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you, Asaf, for the comprehensive and I think very detailed view of how to take the frameworks, the security frameworks and the privacy regulations, and turn them into a information security management system and the things you need to take a look at it from a governance and data risk perspective. And just to summarize what Actifile is offering you before we go into the Q&A session. So Actifile is a very unique data security platform. It's the only solution in the market that identifies any type of sensitive data across files, different types of files, across different types of locations, and automatically encrypts it in case you decide to actually secure the data, not just discover, classify, and monitor it across endpoints, file servers, and cloud repositories, and all of that in real time. So it's a multi-tenant, cloud-based management portal. It's pre-configured to all the relevant types of PII and types of regulations that you should adhere on the local and global level. It provides you also the ability to customize the classification of data if you need to, and we can help you with that. Immediately after you deploy Actifile across those different, nodes or targets of data, immediately it starts quantifying the data risk the way Asaf showed. So it applies a very sophisticated algorithm of assessing the total potential damage on the level of one record of PII and aggregating it and showing you on a monetary level all the different, views that the staff showed you earlier per age, per specific device or specific location. It could be an endpoint, it could be a server, it could be a cloud repository. It immediately starts monitoring the flow. This is a very important aspect. The staff showed that. You want also to understand the usage, not only what happens at rest, where is the data. You want to understand which applications and which users are doing what with your data in real time. That means that you can see what applications are in use, whether it's locally installed application or cloud apps. It could be WhatsApp web, it could be Slack, or it could be your CRM application. And all of them can be cloud or on-premise deployed. And it will show you what users are not just hoarding data, what users are exfiltrating or downloading. Downloading can be also tricky and risky for the organization because they're bringing in sensitive data from other locations. And eventually, if you want to go beyond initial discovery, classification, and usage and application monitoring, you can also apply Actifile automatic encryption. It's a managed encryption option based on the operating system encryption libraries, and it allows you with the click of a button to encrypt the data in a way that immediately protects it from any type of ransomware stealing data or from negligent employees that exfiltrate the data, many times without any malicious intent. And eventually, this managed encryption also decrypts transparently those files with sensitive data that you decided that you want to encrypt in the first place. It decrypts them transparently so the users themselves do not feel that any change was done in the way they operate. There's no latency, no user, no password. So immediately you turn the risk that you found and you manage, you turn that into remediated risk. And you can see that in Actifile. You can see that you had X million worth of euros or dollars of risk, and you remediated via encryption 95 or 98% of that risk, and that's no longer something that threatens you. So all in all, we can help you identify the unprotected, at-risk sensitive data and display who has access to those crown jewels that eventually, if you think about it, all the security frameworks that we discussed earlier are geared toward protecting those crown jewels. So without knowledge how much you have and where is it, it's very difficult to protect. It assesses the exact financial risk and better, help you to better comply with all privacy regulations and different state laws. And through this usage monitoring, it alerts you on data usage anomalies in real time. So new applications that are not sanctioned by the organization or different activities, for instance, uploading via Slack of sensitive data. Again, people want to be productive and cooperative, but they're putting your organization at risk. And eventually it prevents external and internal threats. External being ransomware, and internal being insiders that are negligent by preemptively encrypting the data and providing forensic evidence, God forbid, if there was a breach. So all in all, this is what we wanted to show today. And just to remind you that 95% of all data breaches that, go and put you at risk in terms of compliance and actual, loss of reputation and loss of customers, that many times is much bigger than the potential fines, occur either by human errors or malicious actors. And traditional cybersecurity mechanisms that I'm sure you have in place, you've got your EDR, you've got your firewall, you've got your MFA and all of them. But eventually, if something happens, you need to know what data you had, you need to know who used it, and you need to, or you want to be able to preemptively protect it. So Actifile is your primary weapon of defense on top of everything else. So let's stop with the slides right now. And Michael, I think there were 2 questions on the Q&A. So, or 3 questions already.
There's a number of questions come into the general Q&A, and there's a couple have come directly to myself. So maybe we'll take some of those ones there, generally coming into the Q&A. But firstly, just thank you very much to Guy and Asif in terms of just a really good whistle-stop tour in terms of the view of compliance and the challenges around it, and even building out the risk analysis, etc. But let's hop to the questions here if we can. A question here: why is Actifile? Why Actifile over Azure information protection? What is the compelling reason? Is it a better option?
Yeah, Asaf, would you like to take this question?
Yeah, I saw that there's somebody who okay. Absolutely. So a couple of different things. So one of the main aspects of Actifile, for example, over Azure, is that Actifile is for any application and for any sort of system the data is on. So you might have a lot of data that comes from different CRMs, that comes from banking, financial systems, and so forth. Not all of them are in Azure. Not all of them are in the Microsoft framework. The second thing is, one of the things that that Actifile does that I think Azure information protection under different names and different strategies have been around for a long time. And one of the reasons that it hasn't solved the problem is that it's a very granular approach to solving the problem. And that requires extensive policy writing and extensive implementation in order to actually resolve the risk issue. What the approach Actifile has taken is to say, basically, there is inside the organization, you have to keep the data inside the organization, very simply. There are not a lot of granular controls around that. So you can do some extrusion controls and so forth, but at the end of the day, the intent is to very simply measure the risk and then encrypt as much as you need out of it, so as to reduce the risk without incurring the workflow overheads that are typically part of the sort of rights management approach that the AIP takes. Okay?
So I guess what you're saying, a key part of all of that is the simplicity and making it workable and usable.
Exactly. And the ROI, very quick ROI, so that you're not going into a multi-month or even multi-year sort of project, right? I came from the DLP space. So I was the founder of the Port Authority DLP solution, right? What's called the ForcePoint DLP solution today. And one of the issues there is, since you're working on modifying workflows, getting to an achievable ROI is very time consuming, because you're going and you're looking at what people are sending and what people are doing, and then you put in compensating controls and you do that over and over and over again. and it gets fondly referred to as a alert monster, right? Because it creates tons of alerts, and you need full-time equivalent employees to just manage the thing. And now these people are going to read all of your email with all of your data. So now you need people who are trustworthy in order to do that. So at the end of the day, these types of solutions are very expensive from a deployment and a management perspective, from a resource allocation, time consumption, and so forth.
And that comes to something that we do hear a lot about. There's an awful lot of regulation, an awful lot of compliance has been driven throughout. And I was interested with that Gartner comment that you mentioned, that 75% of the world's population will have its personal data covered under modern privacy regulations by the end of 2024. But ROI is also the driver, and I'm not sure there's anybody out there who doesn't have to face that on a daily basis. But enough about me. Let's maybe just some other questions here. What about securing structured data like a SQL Server databases and column or row level encryption obfuscation? I'll get the word right.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, and hopefully it's for me to answer because I just jumped in.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I was reading numbers, I think from FAIR and so forth, and it turns out that even when you obfuscate the data, still the secondary loss magnitude are almost the same as without obfuscation. So I'm not sure why that is. I was trying to research kind of why that is, and I'm not sure yet. But obviously, when you encrypt the SQL Server databases and so forth, that's very important. It's also part of ISO 27001. So if you don't do that, then you're not going to be not just the 2022 versions, but even the 2013 versions. You wouldn't comply without that. At least if you were, if you're candid with your threat model. But I think that's sort of something you know that your financial customers' information is in the SQL database and so forth. The problem is not where the data is, where it's supposed to be. The problem is where the data is that it isn't supposed to be. So obviously your SQL, your financial services platforms, all those things, the data is there, it should be there. And hopefully you're securing it enough and so forth. But the problem is a lot of employees create reports. A lot of employees need to calculate all kinds of things. A lot of times data comes in from third parties and you're not sure where it's coming in from and where it ends up being. So you end up with a lot of, SharePoint drives. You end up with a lot of OneDrive. You end up with a lot of workstations, a NAS, and so forth, and tons of folders with tons and tons of data. And what's in that? Nobody knows. So I think that's the sort of thing that you need to be very, very careful of. Remember that at the end of the day, when you go to the drop sites under Tor, if you like going to Tor, then you will see a lot of folder structures, a lot of folders with a lot of files, right? If your financial system is well designed, it's probably going to be very hard to break into. Maybe not impossible, but very hard to. But once you get to the file system, then you can take all the Excels and all the CSVs and all the log files and guess what's in them. So,
okay. Just you mentioned ISO there, but another question here: what are your thoughts on extending ISO 27001 ISMS to include ISO 27701 PIMS?
Yeah, so obviously it's so 27701 is an extension of 27001, so it's already pre-configured. I should have included that in the list of sort of the extensions of 27001 to 27701. I think it was there in the earlier iterations of this presentations. One of the problems there is that it's still it's much more prescriptive, but at the end of the day, it's it's not a mandating sort of regulation, right? You go and you say, I'm 27701 and so forth. But at the end of the day, since you're going to be covered by a privacy regulation anyway, under, for example, the Gartner quote, then let's let the regulator prescribe to us what to do, and then let's follow that. If we have very unique data that nobody else has, then maybe we can take that to the 27701 road.
These ISOs really roll off the tongue, don't they? But some other questions that have come directly to myself here. So what does performing a risk assessment entail, and how long does it take to perform a risk assessment?
Let me take that question. That's an excellent question. So it starts with opening up a tenant in our management portal, which takes seconds, and choosing the right regulation types and PII types that you want to cover, another minute or so. Then deploying Actifile, which is very straightforward. It takes a matter of hours to deploy and start initial discovery. Of course, endpoints, file servers, and cloud shares like Office 365. And then the at-rest analysis can be done in a matter of hours. It really depends on the amount of data. What you want to do is to leave the system on for at least another 1 or 2 business days where people actually work. Because once they start working, you start seeing what we call in motion, or the usage patterns. Which applications are being used? Which users are doing what? And then you see very interesting patterns. Then you see the people who are actually taking sensitive data, and we are only tracking the sensitive data, the sensitive files, and what they're doing with it. So I would say it's a matter of initial instantiation of few minutes, deployment of in few hours, and then 1-2 business days to actually see the usage patterns from an application and user perspective. And then you can start, making decisions. Do you want to continue monitoring on an ongoing basis? Do you want to analyze, different usage patterns and warn users about them? Or later on, do you want to consider encrypting some of the sensitive data to avoid, loss or misplacement of the data?
Okay, so I guess there's a follow-up question here in terms of risk assessment. But what do we need to know or to prepare prior to a risk assessment?
So if you're going into a private data, sensitive private data risk assessment, all you need to know is where is potentially your employees and or, of course, customers' data can come from. So if you're an Irish-only company and you don't have any European customers, for instance, then you would, calibrate the system to look only on Irish PII and Irish regulations. If you have any customers or employees in European countries or any other countries, Actifile is a multinational environment. We cover more than, Ireland or the US or different countries in the world, and you can choose them also. You have to be careful not to over-choose. If you don't suspect that you have customers or employees in another state, don't turn it off just by that, because you're creating potentially unnecessary false positives.
Okay, and a question here was: is Actifile a DLP? Therefore,
we're actually trying to solve a similar problem that DLP tried to solve, but in a different way. So DLP, and I think Asaf explained it very extensively earlier, was an event-driven, product. It was standing in the gateway, analyzing each and every event of exfiltration, and trying to make a decision whether or not that's something we should block, yes or no. That created, the need to build a very extensive from scratch list of rules and keep maintaining them on a long-term basis, because the usage has turned. You blocked Skype today, and tomorrow you should block WhatsApp, and the day after you should block Slack, because people started using it. It's endless. So we took a different approach. We took the approach of analyzing what type of sensitive data you have, quantifying the risk, so you make a risk-based decision, aggregating the files to their classification, so all the files that have identity number or passport number or employee number or something like that, and then applying preemptive encryption. That means that even if the file leaves the organization by mistake or by intention that somebody stole it, you never worry about it because nobody can open it outside the organization. They don't have Actifile with the tenant key of that organization. And that causes you, that generates the quick ROI. In a matter of days, not months and years, you can reduce 98% of your risk with no changes to how business works, and without hiring very expensive how to find data security experts. So I think our approach is 180 degrees different. Plus DLP back in the days were targeted primarily to avoid exfiltrations by employees. The concept of ransomware stealing data was not there yet. And the only way to really attack that and avoid that is by means of encryption. And yes, you can add encryption in a DLP system, but that's another integration you need to know and to do and so on. Actifile comes pre-configured to deal with that because we have encryption built in as a managed capability within the system.
Okay, I'm very conscious of time here, and I want to finish within time, so that, because really appreciate everybody taking time out. And the reality of these days is everything is in half-hour, 1-hour slots because we're rushing to the next meeting, and that's the. But really, so it seems to me that some of the key things that are coming out to me are the autumn, and it's quite interesting, and just from what you mentioned there, Guy, in terms of quick ROI. I mean, ROI is something that everybody talks about in every aspect of looking for budget, or whatever it means, or whatever's happening. The automatic part, the ease of use of and the ease of deployment. And sorry, there's one last question here. Oh, sorry, Asaf, I see you're typing an answer to that one. But does the encryption follow the file natively, or does it require a wrapper? Maybe, and
Yes,
wrapping is a good question at this stage.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt since we're at 59 minutes past the hour. But the answer is it modifies the file. It stays with the native name of the file, but it encrypts it transparently so that the applications use it transparently based on the whitelist. So you would define the whitelisted applications like the financial systems, Excel, things of that sort. If they are inside the organization, they'll be able to open the files. But if they take it home on a USB key, or they email it, or to do something like that, then they won't be able to use the data because it's encrypted.
So no wrappers.
Yeah, well, listen, I think wrapping and wrapper is a perfect timing for wrapping up the session, but really appreciate everybody attending. Thank you very much, Guy and Asaf. And what I'd say to anybody is give anyone from the Renaissance team or from the Actifile team a call, and we'd be delighted to make this real for yourselves and get you that quick ROI. So really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you.